happen to have a Dutchman, a very wonderful writer who's actually got the final story here in the anthology. So number 36, come in number 36. Joost de Vries, who is an essayist, editor, writer, and is going to come and talk to us about this story. So, Joost, tell us about your writing. I mean, I'm not going to point out you're the youngest here. You probably are the youngest writer here tonight.
Probably, yeah.
But,
yeah.
But you've done incredibly well in a very short time. You've published 2 novels, and I think the Republic, the second novel, is going to be translated into English.
Yeah, it's now being translated into a dozen or so languages, so that's rather awesome.
It is rather awesome.
Yeah. And as Esther said, it's also a bit weird. The Netherlands is a small country, so when you write a book, you know that some people are going to be interested in. But at the same time, it's going to be translated into South Korea. I mean, there are 40 million people living in Seoul, and they're being hectored by Kim Jong-un with all sorts of missiles, and now all of them have to read my book. So it's weird.
Well, as you know, everybody in this country has read your book. Well, I wish we did, and that's as you know, joke. But so how did you become involved in this? I mean, did you have any personal input into this, or were you just selected?
In this book, no, I was just selected. It's just an email from Joost Zwageman saying he wanted to include my book, and Joost Zwageman made this huge, this monumental anthology of Dutch literature, 3 this big books, one with short stories, one with essays, and one with novellas. And so he made so he selected, and originally his anthology of Dutch short stories was much bigger, and then for the translation he made it smaller, and he wanted to include a bit more recent books because his anthology was from 2004 or something. So he emailed me that he wanted to include my story as last, which is, of course.
And it is because it is the last story, and because it is also features somebody who's dying, or the drama of somebody dying.
Someone pretending to die.
Somebody pretending to die. It has taken on quite a heavy burden of emotion as well, I think, for people in the Netherlands too, because it signifies.
For Joost Zwageman, I mean. Yeah, of course, and it's hard to overestimate how what a big player in the cultural field he was. I mean, he wrote his first novel when he was 23 or something in the early 80s, and became a huge celebrity at the same time.
Was that Gimmick?
No,
Gimmick.
It was first he with a book called De Houtgreep. Yeah, De Houtgreep. And then his second book was Gimmick, and Gimmick was huge. It was like the Dutch equivalent. I should stop using the word "like." I'm not in
You're
America.
young. You're young. You're allowed.
He published the book called Gimmick, and it was the Dutch equivalent of a backpack novel. So very much about artists doing, huge amounts of cocaine and having huge amounts of sex. And that was the book, I read when I was in high school. And I didn't go for the evenings. I went for Gimmick.
It's amazing what you get to read in your schools.
And then over the past 15 years, he kind of stopped writing fiction, and he started writing more essays on art and literature. And he became very much a TV personality, very much always edging people to go to see certain exhibitions or movies or read certain books. So he became, in the cultural world, a very important person, more or less.
And did he influence you in your writing?
Well, I think he was one of the first literary writers I read. I mean, Gimmick and False Light, a book about a student falling for a prostitute. And the other book was, of course, about art and drugs and sex. When you're 16 or 17, those are the books you want to read. I think he was actually one of the first writers I ever met. I remember he came to my high school, and he talked about his book, Gimmick. And so he said, well, are there any questions? And I put up my hand and I said, well, you write a lot about, drugs and sex and women, so how much research did you do? And then he said, well, in every high school I go to, there's someone thinks he's smart and asks me that question. So okay. But he was a very nice guy. I remember when my first book came out, he gave a great blurb, and it was you don't run into that in the literary world a lot. writers being generous to other writers. And he was one of those persons, yeah.
Joost, you're going to read an extract from your story at the number 36.
Number 36, yes.
And it's called A Room of My Own.
Yeah.
Which is
I'm just going to read a bit of it because it's too long to read in full. So what you want, it's difficult to describe a short story. It's basically me. I mean, I can pretend it's a fictional character, but it's pretty much me running into Henry Kissinger in Paris and then traveling to Waterloo to participate in the reenactment of the Battle of Waterloo.
So this really happened?
No. Some writers write, autobiographical fiction, but I prefer fictional autobiographies. It just makes it so much more interesting. I died almost immediately as one of the first. We were advancing up the hill in 3 lines of 50 men towards the British artillery. 30 meters to one side, another 3 lines were advancing. Next to them, another 3. Nobody spoke. Somewhere, someone was playing a drum, a 2-handed ruffle that seemed to be working very slowly towards a climax. We focused on the men 200 meters in front of us. I tried not to think about them in too much detail. They too were wearing uniforms they had made themselves or hired here. The midday sun was burning in our necks. The stiff, cheap material of my uniform chafed against my skin. The sky was as clear as blue ice and made the grass look even greener than it already was. I'd got up very early that morning. The taste of rubber on my airbed was in my mouth. My brother was snoring quietly and rhythmically. His graying, wiry hair was stuck to his forehead. His mouth was so far open, I could see the ridges in the roof of his mouth. Quietly, I unzipped the tent flap and stepped out over the guy ropes of the surrounding dome tents. I could hear others snoring too. The reticent sun was just poking its head over the horizon. There were tents and caravans almost as far as the eye could see. I relished the quiet. It was nice to stand there awake, surrounded by all those sleeping people, as if the day was mine alone, as if I knew something they didn't. My piss was rustling on the dry pine needles with a sound like crackling ice, when suddenly I was startled by a horseman. Though he was already close by, I hadn't heard the hoof steps. A man in a French cavalry uniform and a grey horse, with a saber and all, a cigarette in his mouth and a coffee in his hand. "Bonjour, monsieur," I said. He nodded, the slightest of gestures, a gruff really, as if my presence disturbed him. Perhaps he wanted the day for himself, too. He spurred his horse, and before he fully disappeared around the corner of the amenities building, at least another 20 cavalrymen galloped past. James Salter once wrote that the irresistible thing about being a fighter pilot was that everything revolved around you. The aircraft carrier put out to sea for you, the mechanics on board, the technicians, the radio operators, the cooks, the cleaners. They were all there so you could take off. I've had felt that very feeling my whole life. The family I grew up in definitely revolved around me. The schools and universities were there for me. The newspaper existed for me, the bookshops, the literary festivals. But the cavalry rode past me and ignored me as if I was invisible. The ground shook. A horse snorted. They swished their tails. The rider sat straight but relaxed. They didn't deign to look at me, but I stood there with the happiest grin on my face. The British front line was now 120 meters away. Just as I tried not to think about the British soldiers, I tried not to look at the spectators, who were 150 meters away, behind orange tape with their zooms and binoculars. I was able to concentrate exceptionally well on the here and the now, my existence, my uniform, the way we were all marching, the tension in my back, which I was holding so much straighter than usual. We were marching now downhill. The valley between us and the Brits was more difficult because you had to hold back to avoid going too fast and breaking formation. This was the moment the British opened fire. A cannon directly in front of me fired in my direction as if someone was sneezing in my face, the sound already swooshing past me before the white plume had fully emerged from the barrel. The crazy thing was that all the time I had a sense of having experienced this before. The clouds of gunpowder smoke from the blanks merged until the British line was hidden from view and wouldn't reappear until we were 70 meters away. and Marshal d'Erlon on his horse behind us blew a whistle, and we knew it was our turn to attack. Vive la France! Vive l'Empereur! Suddenly I realized I was about to die. We agreed in advance that at 80 meters we would speed up and come within historic range of fire, and that 5 soldiers would fall per 10 meters. Volunteers, our guide from the previous day had asked. I'd raised my hands, and only now did I understand why. Men rushed over the grass, holding their jolting muskets with both hands, as if they were oars and they were used to propel themselves forwards. We could see the Brits taking aim. Our drums sounded much louder now. Our rented boots were in even more danger of falling off. A British officer raised his sword. We reached 50 meters. Our knee lines broke up. We reached 45 meters and saw the sword coming down. The first loud bang sounded. We saw the flashes of fire and the plumes of smoke rising from the British muskets, and I let myself fall forwards at full tilt. I held my musket in front of my chest with both hands. My face hit the grass. My head went flying. I tasted earth. I had offered to die because it felt like it was supposed to feel, as if I was making some sort of sacrifice. The soldiers in the lines behind me stepped over me without a backward glance, and again I felt a tingling through my whole body. It was something psychosomatic. I was lying there deliciously inert in the soft grass. I felt a pull of gravity. I felt the world turning, and I felt hopelessly, infinitely alone. It was a pleasant, unmelancholy kind of loneliness. The sense of being in a crowd without being absorbed by it, and feeling more individual as a result. The further away from me the French soldiers ran, the happier I became. It was really like that. I could feel myself becoming truly happy, as if someone had injected me with a serum. I felt it passing through my body. France. This country had given me so much. It had been so long since I had experienced this. It was summer, it was France. It has always been the happiest weeks of my life. So uncomplicated. My brother being here heightened that feeling, as if I'd gone back in time, all those summer holidays. From our regular campsite to the nearest village was 5 or 6 kilometer hike, the winding road up a mountain. There was almost no traffic. Lavender grew in the verges. Invisible crickets made their scratchy sound. You passed a small farm where you could buy jars of jam. The farmer was nowhere in sight. You had to leave a few francs. There was faith in human honesty. Almost every day, I walked to the village in the blazing sun, mostly with a tower over my shoulders to keep them from burning. I told my parents I was going to play football with friends or I was going to the river, but I never went. I never had any purpose. I walked and I wanted to do it by myself. I never took a Walkman with me. In the invariably sleepy villages, I bought a roll of Mentos at most, and then I walked back. I got so tanned, so blonde, I was so skinny. I wanted it all to myself. The country, the days, my life. At the weekly karaoke evening, I sang Blondie's The Tide is High with Hugo. With friends, I played 6,000 games around a table on a tilting concrete table tennis table behind the toilets. During our first holiday, I got to be a linesman for the annual football tournament. We listened to Phil Collins' greatest hits. It was the only CD we brought with us. We visited markets in nameless villages, brought bags of fresh herbs, sent 24 postcards each. We never bought ice lollies, but stopped at supermarkets where we'd buy a tub of vanilla ice cream, which we'd eat with the disposable plastic spoons we brought with us for that purpose, shoveling it in so fast it all gave us brain freezes. I remember those summer holidays. I remember how my father asked me if I wanted to go for a drive and how we'd cruise the provincial back roads without any destiny at all, crisscrossing the countryside, passing tiny villages, drinking a Coke somewhere. In the summer before my 18th birthday, I lost my virginity to a French girl. I don't never really like the sound of that lost. I didn't lose anything. I gained something. That's how I saw it at the time. That's how I saw it now. She gave me a present, and that present was her, and I treated it with appropriate haste and awkwardness, just like immediately ripping the wrapping of a gift you're very happy to receive. But it was cheerful. We were grinning. Afterwards, we went to a small river that flowed past the campsite, and we floated on our backs hand in hand, letting the current carry us downstream. The blue sky, the sun, looking up through our lashes at the mountains on either side of the Gorge du Verdon. We went so far that we ended up having to walk back 5 or 6 kilometers on our bare feet. But we were together, just the two of us, and holding hands, and when we got back, it was already dinner time. Doing the dishes, I remember shedding a few silent tears because the day was over, because I let it slip through my fingers. Lying on the grass of Waterloo, I felt the drone of the horses' hooves, which must have been similar to the sound of a small earthquake. I heard shouting, but it didn't get through to me. I wasn't lying there in my role because my role felt so much more real than anything else. I was in the past, completely. Just not the past that was being fought out here, but something much smaller, a much less distant past. France. This country had given me so much. That was what I was thinking now I was lying there. Until I realized I wasn't in France at all. Waterloo was Belgium, a country's history was somehow profoundly forgettable, a country which I never really enjoyed doing anything. But I was lying there in French uniform, fallen for the glory of the French Empire. The agreement was you had to stay where you fell. Medical orderlies would come to kiss you back to life, as it were. The reenactors were then allowed to return to the starting positions and take part in the subsequent charge. Let them take their time, I thought. Let me lie here as long as possible. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see other casualties on the ground, meters away. I could have tried to see them and see if there were any familiar faces among them, but I closed my eyes. I assumed a fetal position and concentrated very contently on my own death.